The Industrial Revolution was perhaps the most significant development in European history. It fueled the creation of the modern economy and established European domination over other civilizations. The work of many great pioneers that contributed to the Industrial Revolution is widely recognized. However, many ignore its grave social consequences. The peasants were exploited in newer forms by the wealthy, despite their contributions. Rural lifestyle deteriorated under the new demands of industry. Even though the people affected may be peasants, they were a major part of history. This is the history of the peasantry. It is winter in Great Britain during mid-18th century Europe. A mild winter day is a tough one, but it is another day of important work. On this fertile land is a garden, the place the peasants are the most preoccupied with.
Ready to work? The peasants weren't the most well off in terms of wealth or quality of life, but they just survived off the land that they had, and they grew their own food. It's a very simple lifestyle.
Using inefficient hand tools, the peasants were able to work the land to produce enough food for them to survive. They usually worked hours each day to ensure that the land remained sustainable. The family structure of the peasants was nuclear, consisting of a husband, wife, and children. All of these members played a role in the family economy, contributing valuable resources to form some sort of self-sufficiency. The peasants continued their life under the family economy, but their struggles were unwaveringly present. In order to survive, the peasants needed to adapt to any unexpected events and had developed a sort of hardiness to the uncertain rural conditions of the time. Food scarcity was always a potential threat that lingered across the seasons. Difficult manual labor was required to produce a good harvest, and there was no guarantee that would happen. Still, the peasants were resilient and survived the tough circumstances of the 18th century. They did not have complete freedom over their lives, but they had enough to control their survival.
The peasants' lifestyle revolved very much around survival and the seasons. So they depended a lot on nature, so they had to sync up their lifestyles with that. And because of this, they were very much at ease and peace when they were in nature.
Because much of the food they harvested was used for consumption, they could not sell much of a surplus to make money. Everything was to be done independently to contribute to the family economy. Rural conditions were unforgiving and required a lot of energy from the peasants. Yet, they could not preoccupy themselves, for more work was needed to be done tomorrow. A new day has arrived, another normal day for the peasants. But one may ask, what is the point of all this manual labor? Why do the peasants maintain this rural lifestyle when no tangible progress is being made? The answer to these questions lies in the social structure of the 18th century England, which was organized into the nobles, merchants, artisans, and the peasants. The relationship between the nobles and the peasants explains the monotony of peasant lifestyle.
The nobles lived very glamorous lifestyles. They pretty much had it way easier than the peasants did. They owned a lot of land, they're very wealthy, and because they owned a lot of land, they had a lot of power over the peasants. So they could pretty much control them and do whatever they wanted. And they also lived in very big mansions, and big houses. So it was pretty nice to be a noble back then.
But how did nobles treat the inferior peasants? While they were somewhat interested in the well-being of the peasants, they mostly took advantage of them.
Because the peasants were owned by the nobles, they did not like authority because nobody wants to do what other people tell them to do. And so they just had to work for the nobles because they didn't have any other options, because they had to get food and survive, and that was the only way of surviving back then.
The peasants were forced to follow the rules of conduct dictated by the nobles. In exchange for working on the land, the peasants were given protection and freedom. They were heavily reliant on the nobles, so much so that this exchange became a regular part of peasant life. But with the arrival of new agricultural practices and innovations, the nobles no longer needed the peasants for the labor they traditionally provided.
Starting in the 1780s, a developing production system began to dominate England, and what would soon drastically change the economic landscape in what is called the Industrial Revolution. As land became privatized to increase efficiency, new agricultural practices and technologies were instituted. Because these practices did not require as much labor, many peasants were left without jobs that they originally had with the nobles. In what historians call the enclosure movement, the majority of peasants were kicked off their land, contributing to a widespread poverty at the time. Without sufficient income to survive, many peasants migrated to where the jobs were located, in urban areas. Peasants traditionally lived in rural areas that had no connection to urban life, but with the pressure of getting a job to obtain food, they were forced to leave the places they were so used to.
After the peasants had lost their jobs, they didn't know what kind of work they would be doing, because during the Industrial Revolution, the cities would be creating factories and different kinds of jobs, so the peasants had no idea what they were getting into.
Industry was built off the growing investment and demand for efficient production of consumer goods. The rising consumer demand from population growth necessitated the development of factories and machinery to produce a sufficient number of products. Additionally, the scientific culture of England and its access to resources made it possible for technological developments to occur.
The work of inventors such as John Kay, James Hargreaves, and Richard Arkwright contributed machinery to the manufacturing process and made it a lot more efficient. One example is the spinning jenny by James Hargreaves, which made the spinning of threads much more efficient and replaced all the traditional hand looms.
These inventions relied on manual labor and efficient energy, which was provided by the peasants and water power. The centralization of factors of production made the industrial process more organized and capable of meeting consumer demand. Centralization also encouraged urbanization, as cities contained factories that were crowded with influxes of economic migrants. Overcrowding proved to be a major problem for the unprepared cities.
Urban living conditions for the peasants were very, very horrible. They didn't have a lot of the necessities they needed to survive, like food and water, and they were very, very uncomfortable in the city environment compared to the nature that they were at peace with back at home.
Indeed, urban conditions were a result of the mass poverty within cities, invoking carelessness among its residents. Because of the city's unsanitary conditions, diseases such as cholera took over, causing urban life to be intolerable.
The era of industrialization brought a new class of society, the factory owners. This group typically invested in an industry hoping to make a profit at the cost of the workers. Factory owners were extremely wealthy while their employees struggled.
The conditions of the factories that the peasants worked in were horrendous. Without any governmental regulations in effect, factory owners did not have to provide a clean habitat for their workers. Additionally, the owners exploited the labor that the peasants provided, and even hired women and children to do the unsafe tasks.
Similar to the relationship they had between the peasants and the nobles, they also had a similar exploited relationship between the peasants and the factory owners. So the factory owners exploited their cheap labor and made them work under horrible working conditions.
The manufacturing process had standardized the production of goods, making the workers' relationship with the work distant. Because the work was monotonous and impersonal, early factory conditions were insufferable for the peasants. Quite simply, they were not used to the demands of urban life.